Dear students, welcome to our science episodes. Today we are going to continue discussing reproduction in plants. Now we know that plants can reproduce sexually. Plants reproduce sexually by the male androecium and the female gynoecium reproductive organs through the first step is pollination, and the second step is fertilization. Pollination is when pollen grains mature and become well developed. The anther splits up longitudinally, releasing pollen grains in the air. The process of the transfer of pollen grains from one flower or from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, this is called pollination. Types of pollination: auto or self-pollination. This is when pollen grains transfer from the anther to the stigma in the same flower or another flower of the same plant. This takes place in hermaphrodite flowers where the anther and the stigma develop at the same time, like for example flax plant. It takes place also in flowers that do not bloom before being fertilized, like in barley plant. Another type of pollination is the mixed pollination, and this is when pollen grains transfer from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another one on a different plant. It takes place in unisexual flowers like maize plant, and also in sunflowers where the anther and the stigma never grow at the same time. Methods of cross-pollination. Pollen grains are transferred from one flower to another by many ways. Pollination by air, where the flowers are characterized by the presence of hanging anthers. These are hanging anthers, easily opened by air, and their stigma are feathery and stick to catch pollen grains. Air-pollinated flowers produce huge amount or numbers of pollen grains to compensate what are lost in air. And pollen grains are light in weight, dry, and can be easily carried by air currents. Do you know what is hay fever? Hay fever is an allergic disease. It affects people who are allergic to pollen grains. The symptoms of the disease are allergic rhinitis, itchy eye, congestion, and sneezing. We discussed pollination by air. Now there is pollination by insects. Flowers are characterized by the colored and scented petals to attract insects like bees to feed on its nectar. Pollens are sticky or having coarse surfaces to stick to the insect's body. And then, of course, the insect will transfer the pollens from one flower to another. There is what is called artificial pollination, and it takes place by the help of man, as when the gardener spread palm trees' pollen grains over their female flowers. Let's discuss together pollen grain germination activity. You will get diluted sugar solution, glass slides and covers, water, and a microscope. Put a drop of the diluted sugar solution onto a glass slide, then add pollen grains and cover them with a glass cover. Repeat the previous step, replacing diluted sugar solution with water. Put both slides in a dark, warm place for half an hour. Then examine both slides using the microscope. What you will observe that the pollen grains will germinate, forming a pollen tube in the sugary solution. They do not germinate in watery solution. And as a conclusion, the pollen grains germinate, forming a pollen tube. This is a pollen tube. and it contains 2 male nuclei. And when the conditions are suitable, they germinate. So they germinate when there are nutrients, as in a sugary solution. But when there is only water, they will not germinate. Now we will discuss together steps of fertilization. First of all, the pollen grains stick to the stigma and secretes a sugary solution. Here is the pollen grain, which will stick to the stigma. The pollen grains begin to germinate, forming a pollen tube containing 2 male nuclei. This tube will extend through the style downward to reach the ovum by something called micropyle. This micropyle will open into the ovary. The tip of the pollen tube degenerates. It will disappear in order that one of the 2 male nuclei fuses with the egg to form a fertilized ovum, which is known as the zygote. The zygote in turn undergoes a process of successive divisions to form the embryo inside the ovum, which develops to become a seed. So from a zygote to an embryo to a seed. At the same time, the ovary grows to become the fruit. Simply, fertilization is the fusion of the male cell, which is the pollen grain, and the female cell, which is the ovum, as we said before, forming the zygote. The zygote is the fertilized ovum, resulting from the fusion of the 2 male nuclei with the egg nuclei. Each male cell nucleus and the female cell nucleus carry half of the genetic information of the parents. Fruits. Fruits differ from each other according to the nature of the ovary. Why? Because the ovary, after fertilization, will produce the fruits. If the ovary contains only one ovum, it gives rise to a fruit with a single seed, like olive and peach. While if the ovary contains many ova, it will give rise to a fruit with many seeds, like beans and peas. Now it's time for questions. Fill in the blanks. Sexual reproduction in plants takes place through pollination and fertilization. In pear plants, stigma grows before the anthers. They show mixed pollination. Flowers pollinated by wind are characterized by the presence of hanging anthers and feathery stigma. A zygote is produced as a result of fusion of male pollen and female ovum. Now write the scientific term. The process of the transfer of pollen grains from anthers of a flower to the stigma. This is called pollination. It is the fusion of the male cell, which is the pollen grain, with the female cell, the ovum, forming a zygote. This is fertilization. A disease that affects people allergic to pollen grains. Hay fever. Thank you. Dear students, thank you for watching and see you later in other science episodes.